Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to the special edition of Around the Desk, DHQ's weekly, sometimes more than weekly live stream show. Joined by most of the normal gang, Scott Tranter, Alex L. Dunstan, Alex Podcool, and of course, we do have one member of the team that's not here today, but we're thinking of you, sure, and wish you were here. Have fun at office hours. But we're doing this show a little differently because we have some announcements to make. So why don't we get right to that? Scott, do you want to make the big announcement? If we have a drum roll or something, perhaps.
We should have had a drum roll. We are expanding in international elections. We're going to start by covering the UK epic election next Thursday, where just more chaos will ensue. We'll be doing more international throughout 2020, but the UK is a big one, so that's where we started. You're going to see results on the website. We'll have the normal DDHQ breakdown and live stream that night. So, go to DecisionDeskHQ.com and you can sign up so you can see the live UK results on Thursday. Also, we have with us the Lean Toss-Up guys, Evan Scrimshaw and Robert Martin, who are going to help us cover all of that. They're on today. You guys want to introduce yourself?
Rob, go ahead first.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Robert Martin. I'm the CEO and founder of Lean Tossup. We started as just a Canadian elections coverage thing. We started making Canadian election models for the Canadian federal election and provincial elections, and we've built a UK model and we're expanding to other countries as well. And yeah, we're happy to team up with you guys to cover some of these international elections.
Yeah, model for the recent election. I'm sorry, Evan. I just want to jump in there and maybe tell people how that worked out.
Yeah, so I'm Evan Scrimshaw, head of managing editor, head of content. The Canadian federal election was October 21st. We won. We were the best polling aggregator. We were closest in terms of your sort of the overall top line projection to the actual results. We tied for first in terms of most individual seat calls correct. We were the ones who called a strong liberal minority government, which is what we got. Most everybody else thought it was going to be tighter than it was. It wasn't actually that close in the end. We have an interest in international elections. We're nerds, so Rob and I have definitely dived into the UK, some other stuff that's coming in 2020, and we're just really, really glad to be able to work with the great DDHQ team to cover these interesting elections.
So the UK, where is it now? What do we think is going to happen on Thursday?
I'll start. I think Boris Johnson, the Conservative Prime Minister, will be returned to office with a majority government, which he did not have when he inherited the office earlier this year. I think he'll get a majority. I think he'll get a decent majority. The size of the majority, I think, at least, is the question of the election, not whether he gets one or not.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I think when you're looking at any UK model at this point, the question really just is how big that majority is. Is it going to be is he going to scrape it out with like a 10, 20 seat majority, or is he going to have a much bigger substantial majority, 50, 60, possibly even 100 seats, right? And I think that's really where the models are diverging, and that's kind of where the question is. It's like how many seats are close, right? When you look at some of these seats, is Boris going to win this seat? Is he going to win it by a mile? Is he going to win it by a little bit? That's the thing. And that's really where the polling and some of the demographics that we're seeing are really kind of influencing in particularly our model. It's influencing exactly where we see some of these seats and how competitive they are.
Yeah, that's one thing I wanted to start with. As we dive into this, we have a slide here about where these things stand based on the most recent election.
Hey Drew, before
the Conservatives thought they would have a great turnout post-Brexit. Didn't quite work that way for Theresa May. Had a minority government where they had to partner with the
the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland.
Right, Northern Ireland Party. So what do they have to do to get that majority? It's they're going to have to win a substantial number of seats, right? What are they looking at as their overall goals?
So to get just a bare overall majority, they just need to gain 9 seats, net of 9 seats off of what they had in 2017. They got 300. 8. There's weird things with the speaker, but whatever. They need to get to 326 seats. They got 318 seats last time. The thing is, they're going to lose a couple of seats to the smaller Liberal Party, the Liberal Democrats. They're going to maybe lose some seats in Scotland to the Scottish National Party, and therefore they need to make up somewhere between 15, 20, 25, depending on how many seats you think are going to go to the smaller parties off of the main opposition party to get that majority government. So that's basically what they need to do. Whether they can get there is a separate question.
So, before we get into some of the a deeper dive into your seat projections and some of the other guys, just curious, what are some of the unique challenges to doing this kind of stuff in the UK? What are some of those compared to, like, your experiences with the Canadian elections or United States elections?
Well, so the biggest change in the UK, specifically in relation to say Canada or the US, is just the sheer number of parties, right? I mean, you've got Scotland, which has a Scottish National Party. You've got in Wales, you've got Plaid Cymru, that's a Welsh National Party, and you've got Northern Ireland, where none of the other major parties compete in Northern Ireland. It's all completely different things. So that's the biggest challenge is, of course, the parties and trying to figure out exactly where their support cuts in along the electorate, right? I mean, in Canada, mostly Canada to the extent, mostly in the US, sorry, and to a lesser extent Canada, like, I mean, when you look at a congressional district or a state, it's like, okay, is the Democrat going to carry it or is the Republican going to carry it, right? That's really the only two options. But here, in the UK specifically, it's like, oh, maybe is a third party going to take it? Is maybe if the seats in Scotland, maybe the SNP will take it, right? If it doesn't fit demographically with the other parties, maybe they'll rise up and take it, right? So that's kind of the challenge. Whereas before, like, if you call it wrong, just the other party won it. But in the UK, if you call it wrong, maybe a completely different other party won it, right? And I mean, that matters in terms of the overall top line, right? Because if like enough third parties start taking it, then like that's when it really starts driving up the chances of like a minority or a hung parliament, as they call it in the UK. Basically, it drives up just the chances of chaos and forces like weird electoral coalitions that have to happen to actually form a governing party, right?
Cool. And you bring up a good point about the number of parties. Do you think that we're seeing a lot of strategic voting going on, especially as we get closer to the election, Lib Dems versus Labor, that sort of thing?
And before we dive into strategic voting, give us the 10-second overview what strategic voting is. Either Evan or Robert.
Basically, if you are a Brexiteer who doesn't like the Conservatives, but you want Brexit, you'll vote for the Conservative people. You might vote for the Conservatives anyways. If you're a Remainer who doesn't like the Labour Party, you might vote for Labour anyways because you want to stop the other side.
And this is common in multi-party parliamentary systems. People may not vote for their party.
It's literally why the Canadian Liberal Party continues to win elections. It's why the Liberal Party of Canada just won an election, despite the fact their Prime Minister wore blackface.
Got it. So tactical voting, where do you think it's occurring in the UK? Or how do you think it's occurring in this election?
I'll take a first stab at it. Rob can add something if I miss it. Basically, you're seeing voters who voted to remain in the 2016 Brexit referendum, who don't like the Conservatives, are going away from the Liberal Democrats and going to Labour because Labour is a more viable pro-Remain party. Same thing is happening with Nigel Farage's Brexit party. They stood down in a bunch of constituencies. They're mostly not running in this election. They've mostly conceded they won't win the election, and therefore their supporters are going to the Conservative Party because if you're a Brexit Party supporter, you would much rather a Boris Johnson government giving you 80% of what you want than a Labour government that gives you 0% of what you want. And if you're a Lib Dem or a Liberal Democrat, you would much rather a Labour government that gives you 80% of what you want, as opposed to a Tory government which gives you 0% of what you want.
Yeah, and I think that's really the case. I mean, I think we are starting to see that strategic voting. There are, however, a number of constituencies that, for example, the biggest terms of strategic voting we're seeing is definitely between Labour and the Lib Dems. So these are both pro-Remain parties. They generally, there's some people in the Labour Party who would rather see them like the UK leaving the European Union, but by and large, both of them are mostly Remain parties. And the thing is, you're seeing a lot of people who typically would vote Lib Dem in a lot of close, like, for example, if you say you're a Lib Dem supporter and you live in a seat that's mostly between the Conservatives and the Labour, right? Then in that case, you're deciding, okay, I'm going to vote Labour because they have a better chance, right? I'd rather see Labour win this seat then the Conservatives win the seat, because then in that case, then I have a chance to get what I want. But there's a lot of seats specifically in the South where you see the exact opposite, right? Where these are classic Lib Dem conservative battles. And if you're typically a Labor voter, maybe you're saying, okay, maybe you know what, I'll vote Lib Dem this time, because you know what, although I'd rather see a Labor government. Labor doesn't actually have a chance in this seat, but the Lib Dems seem to be pitching just the right message for people in this area that Lib Dems might actually win it, and I might actually get to see a second referendum or an attempt to stop Brexit, right? So, because obviously there's essentially an unofficial coalition agreement between the two of them, where if they form a majority, then there may not be a functional government for very long, but there at the very least be a second referendum on membership to the European Union.
Got it. So that's a good primer on kind of what's going to happen. One other thing just before we kind of deep dive into the UK election preview. So polls essentially close at 5 Eastern time, New York Eastern time, next Thursday. And can you guys give us the 30-second preview of how voting's going to go? Like, how does this work?
I'll take that. So polls close at 5 o'clock. The BBC, ITV, Sky exit poll comes out at 5 o'clock. Everyone spends 45 minutes freaking out about the exit poll result. We get a couple of results from northeastern seats over the next hour. You start to then get a flood of seats from about 7, 7:30, 8 o'clock, accelerating out. And then you get seat-by-seat declarations of the full result. You don't get partial results.
So let me cut you off right there. What you're saying is, just for everyone who hasn't seen this stuff, seat-by-seat declarations is, imagine every congressional district in America, they would go up at the end of the night, and the party leaders would come up and say, this person won, or this person won, and they go around all of the municipalities, which is their version, their closest analogy to a congressional district. Is that right, Evan?
Yes. All the candidates lined up. You have a local official.
Are there any fights? Like, I feel like that's like the preview to a boxing match. Like, these guys get up there and they announce their votes. Like, does anyone ever get up there and like throw a punch, or do they lie about something? Like, it seems rife for like.
No. Unfortunately, the process.
There's no WWE. Okay.
Everybody would know if it was. Everybody would know if fishy behavior happened. But basically, we get a few results early. We all freak out about them because that's all we have. We have the exit poll, which may or may not be right. And then we start to get a flood of results in about 7, 7:38, 8:39, and that's the point at which you can start basically confirming the exit poll or saying, no, the exit poll is wrong.
How accurate are the exit polls in the UK?
They're either really, really, really accurate or they're bad.
They're more accurate than the polling. I'll say that.
But that's not saying anything.
That's not saying much, but it is saying that they don't miss wildly. Like, you're not going to see, if they say a conservative majority, you're not going to see a Labor majority. Like, they can miss in certain directions. Like, if they say a conservative majority, maybe it could be a minority, or if they say a conservative minority, you can get a majority. But it's not going to be like 100. Like, it's very, very rare, especially in modern times, to see something like 100 seat difference or something. Like, it's somewhat close to it. Maybe you could see 20 seats either way, but it's not.
So Brexit was, pretty surprising result. How did the exits do with the referendum?
They didn't have an exit poll for the referendum. In 2017, in the 2017 general election, the exit poll was almost frighteningly accurate. In 2015, it lowballed the Conservatives by 16 seats, which isn't a horrible result, but it is a horrible result if you take into account the fact that 16-seat difference was the difference between a Tory government that may or may not be able to last for a while and a majority Conservative government that, had the governing numbers to last for a while. They chose not to, but that was a choice, not a forced decision.
Got it. So just to recap for everyone, kind of go around, is polls close at 5 o'clock. We're going to know a couple hours in. They go around and say it. We're going to be covering that live. We're going to have results on Decision Desk HQ, so you can go check that out, just like we do in the U.S. Evan and Robert, who we're going to continue kind of deep dive into the UK election preview, they're going to be with us on Thursday night, kind of breaking it down, just like we've done on previous election nights. And this is something they've been studying and modeling for a little while now, so they've got some insight we don't have. Let's do this. This is one of our favorite games. If you had to pick someone right now, if you had to pick Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn, who do you want to be right now?
Boris
Johnson, it's not close.
1,000%.
Drew.
Oh, Boris, because he looks like he has a lot more fun, plus he's going to win.
I mean, Boris Johnson, that's the guy who paints buses for fun, so clearly he's killing it.
Bit of improv.
Podcool, who do you want to be?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say Boris. Maybe I wouldn't be as confident, because at the top we were when we were just introducing the 2019 election, I think we were saying one of the big things we're going to be watching on election night is not necessarily who's going to win, but who's going to win and by how much. And so maybe I'm a little bit more bearish, but I'd still rather be Bojo than anybody else.
How about you, Al Dunson?
I mean, I think it's clearly Corbyn, right?
Dr.
Alex also thinks Mitch McConnell's going to have a rough election in 2020. So,
Oh God. Okay.
Shore's not here, but I would imagine Shore is definitely Jeremy Corbyn as well. No, you definitely want to be Boris Johnson, right? Like, if you just look at the polling averages and then the model averages, what we'll all get into now. I mean, it looks like that's where it's going to go.
Yeah.
So oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so on the screen right now, we kind of have the aggregation of how the polling stands right now, just using kind of the public polling sources. And directionally, it's been a steady race, looking at kind of the top 5 parties. For the past year, long before the election was announced in the first place. But then here, so we've started the chart here at August 2019 up to the most recent, as of this morning, polls dropped. And here we're showing a pretty large lead of conservatives, north of 40%, with Labor hovering just north of 30%. And so here, on the screen that you're looking, we have the dots indicate individual poll results, and the line is our polling average that we've calculated. And the polling average takes into consideration the recency of the polls as well as the number of polls from a particular pollster. And so if you'll see, for example, on the Labor polling average, it's running a little bit behind of where the polls are. And that's just because we're providing a little bit of a conservative estimate in the statistical sense by saying that, well, this is sort of where the overall trend is going. What kind of reactions do we have of people around the desk looking at this polling average? Because it seems to be a steady climb north for Boris Johnson over the past few months.
I just want to clarify for everyone watching on a phone, blue is not Republican and red is not Democrat. Blue is not Democrat and red is not Republican. That threw me off too. Blue is conservative and Labor's red.
Like it is like in every other country, apart from the U.S.
Yeah. I mean, pod called MAGA. We're the greatest. I mean, they should all also be on the imperial system too.
I mean, I think the biggest trend obviously is the decline in those third parties, Brexit and Lib Dems. Brexit.
Is that, you think that's tactical voting or tactical poll taking?
Brexit was intentional, right? The Brexit Party and the Conservatives.
Came
to their
What do you think, Evan?
It's partially intentional. It's also partially that, like, if the Brexit Party was falling and then Nigel Farage decided to not stand in all the Tory constituencies, and he did that because it wasn't going to win any of them. Like, basically, it happens in all countries across the world. I've studied this in Canada. It happens in the UK. It happens in Australia. Like, people will say they'll vote for a third party. Then they actually get into an election, and they're like, I can't really do that. Then they get in the middle of the campaign, and they're like, oh, I really can't do that. And then they get to the polling places, and they still can't do that. Because unfortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your view, like, we have an electoral system where you need to elect a winner, and why are you going to waste a vote on a party that can't win? So,
are those candidates still on the ballot there, even though they've sort of...
No, they stood down before there was a nomination, so there are no Brexit Party candidates in the 317 seats that the Tory Party won.
That polling really doesn't matter because you couldn't vote for them if you wanted to.
Yeah, nominations close a lot closer to the election than they do in American. So basically,
so you're saying UK elections don't last 2 years like ours do?
No.
Themselves immediately after they're done. So we have a question from someone on YouTube. They want to know what you think the final seat numbers are going to be, which I know we're going to go into a model here probably in a couple of minutes. But do you think, I mean, to kind of answer not his question, but his question from the stream, is this going to move a lot? In other words, are these models going to move about, I mean, can Labor come back? Are these seat projections, are these polls movable?
So I'll actually take this here. The thing is, so if you look at that graph right there, right, you see about a 10-point gap between Conservative and Labor. Again, so like if you're very familiar with U.S. elections, say the Democrats or Republicans won by 10 points, right? I mean, the other party, the losing party, is still going to win quite a lot of seats. And say this is a House election, right? I mean, you almost had this, right? You had the Dems winning 8 or so points in the 2018 elections. And I mean, yeah, they won a majority, but like the Republicans still got about 190. It's about 30 seats off from even having like 30 seats off from the majority mark. But the thing is, when you get to having these third parties and the way that vote cuts in basically parliamentary democracies, a 10-point lead is massive. That's essentially just a demolition. Like some of these are just not even going to be close. And the thing is, you're going to see a result where conservatives win a seat with like 42, 43% of the vote. And that's going to be replicated they win like 42, 38 in like dozens of seats. And that's what happens when you get a 10-point lead in a parliamentary democracy where the vote is not split 2 ways, but it's split meaningfully 3, 4, in some cases even 5 ways. In terms of the models, though,
before we get into the models, there's a sort of like a back end way of explaining the election. The Tories are getting roughly, and I have this in the site preview that I wrote for you guys, which can be found on dishandeskhq.com. The Tory party are getting about 70% of people who voted to leave last time, and about 17%, 18% of people who voted to remain last time. Labour are getting 50 and like 12. And the thing is that the Tories are winning with their good group of voters, the Tory Leavers and over Labour Remainers, and they're winning with their bad group, Tory Remainers, Labour Leavers. Labour needs to flip one of those two things if they're going to win this election, if they're going to have a hope of getting into some form of government from second place with the SNP, with the Lib Dems. Like, they need to flip one of those two things. They're losing with everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's really the difference between something like our model and the other models. I think you guys have a slide there of the different seats. In the last couple days or so, we've kind of seen some of the other models tighten a little bit in terms of their seat projections. They're coming down somewhat in maybe like less than 350, some like 330 or so. Basically, kind of tightening towards a minority.
So let's go ahead and talk about those real quick.
We got your seat projections.
We have the seat projections up on the screen now. We've got yours as well as some of the other ones that have been released over the last week. They all have obviously conservative lead majority.
They're all, by conservative lead, they're all between 351 and about 359 seats, depending on the election, right? Just to describe it for those folks just listening to this.
Yeah. Labor's in the low 200s for the most part, and then Lib Dem aren't going to really improve very much on their last performance as of now. So, with your model, we noticed that you do have the highest number of conservative seats, lowest number of Labor seats among the seat projections released over the last week. What do you attribute that to?
So that's almost completely demographics. That is, again, this is the thing. Other models are, when you use uniform swing, right? A lot of people in the UK, they love to judge elections by uniform swing. They're like, oh, if the Conservatives are up 8 points somewhere, then they're going to be up 8 points everywhere, essentially. But our model says, okay, they might be up 8 points, but if an area voted Leave, then they're probably gaining more there. But if it voted Remain, they're gaining less in that area, right? And by doing this, the model is able to find a lot of seats in the North, specifically a lot of seats that voted for Leave but typically vote Labour, and our model is saying no, those seats are actually a lot closer than you would get off just uniform swing. And again, the North, if you look at it, is that's probably one of the most like volatile polling regions we've actually seen so far in this election. Usually it's a Labour lead. Again, the North in the UK looks actually very similar to the US Midwest, very similar to, say, a Pennsylvania, an Ohio, or a Michigan, per se. It's actually very similar to that. And this election is going to be kind of a realignment election where these people in the North, they usually voted Labour, but they voted for Brexit. And Boris Johnson, again, one of the reasons why, when you go back to that other graph, when you see the sharp decline in the Brexit Party vote and the increase in the Conservative vote, is because he's basically become the Brexit Party. I mean, his entire campaign slogan is "Get Brexit Done." That's their entire slogan. And those voters in the North, again, usually Labour's supposed to win the North by 7 or so points. Right now, it's basically tied. It's basically like a 2-3 point race, sometimes even tied, right? And from our model, we're able to find a lot of seats that are kind of worse for Labour, that are very Leavey, and our model says they're gone. Whereas other ones, if you look at it and you use that same kind of swing, you still favor labor in those seats, right? And that's really going to be those deciding seats in this election, is where are those kind of labor Levy seats going to go?
Yeah, Robert.
So I'll just give it.
Paco,
real quick, Robert, just a follow-up question. So you said at the top that it was really the demographic characteristics that were driving the difference of your model, and then in addition to that, looking at how the constituencies voted on Leave Remain. What kind of demographic information are you considering kind of beyond some of the political variables that you had mentioned there? Just because I know we have a pretty nerdy audience who might be interested in learning a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so again, our model is extremely limited by what is actually polled. But that being said, Leave Remain is kind of a perfect all-in-one variable for a lot of your demographics. When you look at the Leave vote, the Leave Remain vote itself from the 2016 referendum, it broke very cleanly among educational lines. More educated areas voted to Remain, less educated areas voted to Leave. It voted among age, among diversity. Younger people voted to Remain, older people voted to Leave. And then also in more ethnically diverse places, typically if a place had more immigrations, had more minorities, those places voted to Remain. The more immigration was in an area, those places typically voted to Remain. The places with less immigration, the places that were more white, they voted to Leave, right? And I think if you're listening to this right now, I think you're hearing a lot of parallels to 2016 U.S. presidential election, and that is very intentional in all those cases. That same kind of shift, that surprise upset we saw with the Brexit, that was very similar to kind of the Trump upset we saw in the Midwest in 2016. So basically, our model is just saying we're going to see that again.
I was going to say, as Podco knows, I like to draw parallels between the current U.S. environment and others. Yeah, so I also see a lot of parallels. The educational lines, the rural-urban divide. It's interesting that it's happened at pretty much the same time, right? 2016.
Yeah.
So I have like a sort of like good American parallel for this. The Texas 7th is the Houston district the Democrats picked up last time. I think it was George W. Bush's seat from memory. Those kinds of sort of urban-suburban seats with a lot of like well-educated, well-off professionals, those are the kind of seats that Labor are actually going to win. Like our model has Labor picking up a London seat, Putney, like very confidently, despite the fact that we have them doing like very badly overall. We have them picking up that seat, which other people don't have. We see Labor doing what the Democrats have done and picking up some of these sort of urban-suburban seats. But we also have Labor being just smashed in northern seats. Blair's old constituency of Sedgefield, that's currently going blue, according to us. That's about a 2/3 chance that Tony Blair's old seat, sort of conventional northern Labor heartland seat, it's going to go to the Conservatives because it voted for Brexit by 60%. Like, that's the kind of thing you're seeing. You are seeing the same sort of urban-suburban seats going to the left of center party, and you're seeing the sort of white working class areas going for the right of center party, and you're seeing the same sort of alignments that you saw in 2016, 2018, as you're seeing in UK in 2019.
So we just got a viewer question along these lines. Wants to know how much weight would we give to constituency polls, specific constituency polls? Specifically mentions.
He specifically mentions the Tories are up 15 in Wrexham today. So like
so Wrexham
we have that.
So Wrexham is a Welsh seat. Seat polls in specific are not amazing. We have good pollsters doing it, but we don't have like a good track record of it. I would treat these seat polls the same way that we treated some of those first New York Times upshot Siena polls, which is to say they're good guideposts, but if they came up with something that was completely insane, sort of keep a bit of a spectacle, keep a bit of a skeptical eye. However, the thing about the seat polls is,
real quick,
they're not diverging a lot. They're not diverging a lot from what we're seeing, and so that's why I have a little more faith in them, because in aggregate, they're pointing to big conservative swings in these northern.
Evan, real quick, just
areas.
New York Times Siena upshot polls; those were considered pretty good, not directional.
No, they were, but
just so we can break down. Just answer this: what is the difference between a constituency poll and, say, a congressional poll you see in the U.S.?
We don't have the same track record of them being.
No. Specifically, what's the sample size? What's the mode of data collection? What's the weighting? How many do they do it? Give us the breakdown.
They're generally. I believe the survey polls are phone polls. It's about 500 person sample per constituency.
How big is a constituency? How many?
About 120,000 or so.
Well, it's about 70,000 voters in a constituency.
So 500 sample, N of 500, 70,000 voters. How do they do the weighting or sampling, or what's the normal methodology?
It varies by pollster.
Unfortunately, the British pollsters do have an annoying tendency to want to wait to pass the vote, and sometimes even pass the European Parliament vote, which is just literally meaningless. So some of the weighting and some of the method stuff is definitely questionable and definitely not what I would recommend.
What kind of modes? At that sample size, you probably can't do a lot of online. Are they doing primarily phone?
Some of them actually are doing online. Some are doing online.
For the seat polls, it's mostly phone. I know the Delta poll seat polls of sort of London in the south, they are phone polls. By the fact that Delta poll is an online pollster for their national polls, they are phones. So
well, let me be specific here. When they're doing an online poll in a constituency of 120,000 people, are they not just doing an online poll of a region and then seeing where the sample falls inside the constituency and then waiting there?
No, as far as I could tell,
we can't confirm that fact, but I suspect that's what's actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're probably trying to filter out they're probably trying to figure out who lives in certain seats, and they're trying to filter that out, and then they're probably just oversampling a region, and if they get something extra amount from a certain seat, then they'll probably run with that. One more quick thing, though, about Wrexham before we head off. If you look at our model today, we actually have a conservative 4-point lead there. We've had a bigger lead before. We've just had a couple of good whales to crosstabs for Labour, so it's gone down a bit. But again, not a surprise to our model at all. This is basically, if you want a confirmation of what Wrexham is, this is essentially an old coal town in Wales. Basically, think of this as West Virginia, essentially. This is going to be a key seat on election night. And again, leave, 57.3% to leave, 42.7% to remain, right? So Levy seat, Coalfield, working class, Conservatives leading, so that poll makes complete sense and fits perfectly with our model. Again, if we had a couple weeks ago, we had that. We've just had a couple of good polls for Labour in Wales, and if not, we'd have probably a bigger lead in the Conservatives there as well.
I will just add as a tease for anybody who's going to be watching the live stream on Thursday, Wrexham is generally speaking the first Welsh seat to declare, so we will have a pretty good test of that seat poll relatively early on in the night. Join us at 5 p.m.
Yeah, and I think we're about to wrap up. That's a good preview, you guys. We're going to do a couple of streams next week, but we're going to be covering the UK elections. You'll get the results on the website, and you'll get the analysis here. You're going to see some similar things to what we do in the U.S. We're going to have some key constituencies we're watching instead of key counties, key constituencies. As Evan just pointed out, Wrexham will be one of them. And so we can kind of break this down into the night. I think as we asked earlier about 10 minutes ago in the segment, I think we're all rather be Boris Johnson right now because we think, the Conservatives are going to win. Watch the website. We're going to have an aggregated poll or an aggregated model projection to see, or an aggregated seats model projection coming up next week. We're going to update some of the polling averages, and we're going to talk about this more as we kind of break it down. But this one looks pretty good for Boris Johnson. But then again, for those who remember Brexit in 2016, I think if we were asking the question of who you wanted to be in 2016 before Brexit, I think everyone wanted to be Remain. So, and that didn't turn out exactly how they thought. So it should be interesting. Thanks for joining, Drew. Anything else we want to cover before we're done?
No, just looking forward to having some more stuff up on the website next week, and then, like you said, the live stream next Thursday night, 5 Eastern.
All right, thanks, Lean Toss Up, guys. Appreciate it. Talk to you next week.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks.
Thanks.